Hello everybody to this little video about due diligence. We're going to talk about what is due diligence, where it's coming from and why it is important. First of all, due diligence in general means to check something, right? To audit or assess something. And it is widely applied in many different contexts. For example, when you want to invest in a company, you will do due diligence in a company first to make sure that it's financially healthy, its policies, procedures, business practices are up to your expectations. And in the context of Minds Matter, we deal with supply chain due diligence, which is actually something very similar. It means that companies go to their suppliers and throughout the supply chain and make sure that everybody is acting in a way that is conformant with the relevant regulations and up to their expectations. Responsible sourcing and supply chain sustainability refer to a company making sure that their raw materials are sourced, taking into account, all the responsible environmental and social considerations, and of course legal compliance. Now, basically, when you want to source responsibly, you have to do due diligence. So this is how those two terms are basically related, right? So you do due diligence, which is the process of checking that everything is all right. And as a result, you will know whether you're sourcing responsibly, or as a result, you can work towards sourcing more responsibly. There are three overarching reasons why companies should conduct a supply chain due diligence and why it is important for them. And we summarize them under three keywords: reputation, reliability, and revenue. Now, reputation is an obvious one. No company wants to be associated with issues in their supply chain, like finding out that their suppliers or somebody in the supply chain is relying on child labor or dumping toxic waste in the ocean or something like that, right? So by proactively conducting due diligence, you make sure that everybody in your supply chain is behaving correctly, and therefore you avoid bad press. It will garner a reputation for being a company that cares. Reliability refers to the fact that companies who know their supply chain, they know, of course, that they're sourcing responsibly and sustainably, as we pointed out, but they will also know more. They will know where goods are coming from. They will know where they're going through. So they will be able to plan supply chains in a better way. It became painfully obvious during COVID-19, for example, when suddenly a lot of supply chains came to a halt, and many companies realized they didn't even know where all the goods were going through, and particularly what countries they were running through, and what potential obstacles might be in the way. So by conducting due diligence, you know your supply chains better, you know better, potential risks along the supply chain, not only regarding sustainability, but also regarding logistics, for example, which allows you to plan better, which allows you to develop contingency plans and react in the case of disruptions more proactively and efficiently. Revenue relates partially to the results of the former two aspects. If you have a better reputation, of course, this is positive for you as a company, both with regards to the relationship with your suppliers as well with your customers. If you have a good handle on your supply chains, if they are running smoothly and efficiently, if you know where goods are coming from, you have everything that you need to produce running where you need it, right? So make sure your operations are running without disruptions. The former two, of course, directly or indirectly positively impact the revenue. However, what we also see is that increasingly consumers are ready to reward, also financially reward, more responsible and sustainably produced goods, right? So companies are able actually to increasingly charge premiums on these sort of goods, right? And being able to demonstrate and being confident that your supply chain is responsible, is sustainable, which you found out during your due diligence, is a big part of being able to claim that you're a company that is, conducting business as sustainably as possible. We also see this reflected in share prices. Studies have shown, for example, that companies that proactively conduct a business in a more responsible manner and adopt such practices increase the market value to 4 to 6% on average. For customers and consumers, responsible sourcing is important because nobody wants to be associated with things like child labor, like deforestation, like water, like waste, etc. Right? So by being able to assure your clients that the goods that they're purchasing are free from such negative impacts, you give them, the assurance that they can consume the goods that you're giving them without having any bad thoughts or feelings. And this is something that is increasingly important to customers. Actually, according to a survey from McKinsey, 66% of respondents and 75% of millennial respondents say that they consider sustainability aspects when making a purchase. And as we said, having a sustainable, clean supply chain is a big part of it. Now, for investors, this is equally important. As we said initially at the beginning of this video, when you or I or anybody considers buying stock in a company, you would do due diligence on that company to make sure that they're actually a company that you want to give your money to. And investors are doing the same thing. They're looking at companies, and increasingly, not only do they look at the financial health of a company, but they look at its performance with regards to all sorts of sustainability metrics. And again, the supply chain is a big part of that, because a big part of the products is made up of the components that come into it, which rely on a supply chain. So for investors, even big ones, the big names like BlackRock, increasingly take into consideration those sort of aspects when making an investment decision. So how is this done in practice? Well, due diligence involves both desktop work as well as field work. So a company due diligence officer would conduct a due diligence typically by collecting data from the suppliers, reviewing that and evaluating that, right? Such as audit reports, for example, any certifications that a company might have, any production details, policies, etc. And then they might also visit the company and carry out on-the-ground assessment to actually substantiate the data that they collected and make sure that everything is correct. Generally speaking, there are certain foci that a company can adopt, right? So depending on the materials that you're sourcing, for example, you might choose to look more heavily in one issue than the other. For example, say your company is relying heavily on copper and lithium. You might initially not 100% know where those goods are coming from as you start your due diligence, but you know that a lot of that comes from Latin American countries, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, for example. And you also know that processing of those products requires a lot of water. And then you also know, typically, that in the countries I just mentioned, water scarcity is often a big problem. So what you would do in your due diligence process as you start doing that, for example, you can put a focus on water treatment, water management, to make sure that everybody involved in the supply chain in those geographies is acting, in compliance with all the relevant regulations and conducting the business, as well as possible, protecting the natural resources that are also used by adjacent communities. And then, of course, there's a lot of other focus areas, deforestation, child labor, etc., that you might be aware of or want to be aware of, depending on the geography or on the mineral you're looking into. Now, when it comes to the battery sector, similarly as with other industries, due diligence means that they need to make sure that their supply chain is in order and acting in compliance with relevant laws and regulations. And of course, with regards to the EV batteries, that is also a very difficult endeavor because the sheer complexity of the supply chain involved. If you look at the typical materials, we have cobalt, we have graphite, we have nickel, we have lithium, of course. Those are mined and processed all over the world. So it makes it very difficult to actually identify those supply chains and collect the data that is necessary to be collected also in the context of relevant regulations, like, for example, the EU battery regulation. In addition to that, to the metrics we mentioned before, water, labor rights, etc., the EU conflict minerals regulation also requires gradually to add data about a goods carbon footprint. So this is another metric that would have to go into the due diligence there, collecting data on the carbon footprint and adding it up. Now, to do that, battery manufacturers need to work closely with their suppliers, of course, to identify and mitigate any adverse impacts associated with their supply chains and to make sure that they collect all the data that they need to collect. MindSpider has published an ebook on the EU battery regulation and other regulations that is available on our website if you want to learn more what exactly is required in terms of the regulation. Well, the first step, if you want to get started, is to get internal alignment. The OECD guidance describes due diligence as an ongoing, proactive, and reactive process. So it's not a one-off exercise, but it's actually a continued engagement with your suppliers and your supply chain. Now, in order to do that seriously, it requires the buy-in from probably different departments. For example, compliance, due diligence, procurement, depending on how your company is organized and how big your company is. And importantly, it also requires the buy-in from senior management, which needs to, of course, carry and push that. And then, very likely, in order to get started, it's important to just start doing something. And again, depending on the size of your business, very likely you won't be able to conduct due diligence on every supply chain at once and every detail at once. So you might want to start by identifying certain focus materials or minerals or certain focus issued areas. For example, if you have certain minerals in your products that you know are more risky than others in terms of the geographies that they come from, in terms of the production methods, in terms of typical mining methods, you might want to start with those, right? And look in supply chain for those. Maybe starting only with 1 or 2 suppliers that you have very good relationships with, that would be cooperative. You start conducting this due diligence, you learn from it, and you can replicate it across separate supply chains. Alternatively, if you know a certain issue area, for example, water usage, again, is an increased concern in your supply chains, throughout your supply chains, you might want to start looking into that generally. Again, ideally starting with a few suppliers and then gradually expanding based on the learnings. At MindSpider, we have experience in doing those projects, in conducting supply chain due diligence with the companies that we are working with, and we would be happy to support you in this process. Please feel free to reach out, and please join us for our next videos. Thank you.